Hello, welcome. Welcome. This is the global community for adults who are healing CPTSD. My name is Athena, and I will be facilitating our time together this evening. And if you are new to our community and this is your very first time finding one of our videos, maybe you're listening to this on a replay, or perhaps you're showing up here for the very first time to be here with us during our weekly discussion group. We meet on Mondays, 7 p.m. Eastern, and we're here every week. And we've been showing up here together for over 10 years, almost 11 years. And I'd like to warmly welcome you to our community. We're a very warm and welcoming bunch. We have a couple of moderators that help keep our chat stream safe enough for our community to come here and talk about difficult topics like healing CPTSD. And so a very special thank you to you, John Harvey. Very special thank you to you, Ninja Taco. I couldn't do this without you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I am coming to you this week in week 9 of our series on Pete Walker's most recent book, Holistically Treating Complex PTSD, a Six-Dimensional Approach. And we are right smack dab in the middle of the topic of grief. And interestingly, and a little too on the nose, I am right, for me personally, like I'm feeling a little tender. We're right here in the middle of the topic of grief, and I've been filled with a little bit of grief. I've been grieving. So, yeah, I'm being real with you, just being vulnerable and letting you know that if for any reason my energy feels a little different than it typically does, I don't want you to feel as though I'm in some sort of performative place and I'm just phoning it in or going through the motions. That's definitely not what you're sensing. What you're sensing is I am in my own healing process right alongside you. Everything we share on this YouTube channel is shared from a lived experience perspective. I'm not an independently licensed clinician. I am a lived experience expert and have spoken globally hundreds of times on the topic of healing complex trauma and the benefits of trauma-informed daily peer support, community support, as it relates to healing CPTSD. I do work privately. My clients are helping professionals. I have a private practice, and I help run a nonprofit organization, the Foundation for Post-Traumatic Healing and Complex Trauma Research. And this YouTube channel is sponsored by them, and we have a global community filled with thousands of our community members that are all healing side by side with one another. So there's a link if you'd like to join us. We're there every single day, showing up for ourselves for a few minutes a day, every day, and connecting with others who are on a similar path. So, but as I was saying, I'll end with this. My private practice started off with me just showing up here on YouTube, and people were reaching out to me, people from all walks of life, educators, nurse practitioners, teachers, professors, actors, actresses, members of Congress, people who work for the government in many other countries. And over the course of over 10 years, my private practice is now solely dedicated to holding space for clinicians and helping professionals. My clients are mental health experts, professionals working in the trauma space, psychiatrists, psychologists, independently licensed clinicians, licensed clinical social workers, marriage and family therapists, licensed professional counselors, professors on the topic of trauma informedness, who also work as guidance counselors in university and in other educational institutions. And over the course of almost 11 years and nearly 20,000 client hours, in addition to leading thousands of support groups, what I have come to understand about this beautiful work that we get to do is that it hits us all differently. And it's so very, very important that we attend to our own pain, that we attend to our own processes. Your healing journey is different than mine, and his is different than hers, and theirs is different than all of ours. And I really just want you to know that wherever you find yourself today, whether you're feeling a little tender like I am, feeling a little vulnerable due to the fact that we're right in the middle of the topic of grief, or if you're having a particularly joyful day and it's light and it's filled with a lot of peace and ease and hope, I want you to know that you are welcome here. You are warmly welcome here in our community, and your presence is felt and valued regardless of your ability to be able to be here live having the discussion with us. But if you are here, I want to pause and say hello to you and just say thank you for being here. Hello, and a very warm welcome to you, John Harvey. Thank you for all you do. Thank you, Ninja Taka, for all you do. I appreciate you, Recovery Buddy. Hello, warm welcome to you, Candida, Jeffrey Sherman, Kitty. Hello, hello. Hello to each of you. Oh. Hello, Midnight Blue. Yeah. So I have a feeling that this grieving process that I am going through right now is where it is because I attended a funeral a few days ago. And grief, as you know, just like healing, is cumulative. And this funeral was a service for a loved one of mine, an adopted family member, family, if you will, my friendly family of choice, as are all of you. And what's also true is this week's place where we are in Pete Walker's book couldn't be more well-timed, because the place where we are in Pete Walker's book is actually on page 273, and we are on the topic of angering. And as you know, anger feels pretty delicate and a little untouchable for so many of us who have endured repeated relational trauma. Depending on your level of dysfunction, neglect, abuse, and exploitation, and how old you were when your complex trauma began, when the dysfunction, neglect, abuse, or exploitation began, that is going to determine how comfortable you are with the topic of angering. So to catch you all up, Pete talks about crying and angering in tandem, which we discussed last week. And he also talked about self-compassion last week, and how crying is absolutely the ultimate soothing that we can experience, and that grieving in and of itself, please don't miss this, Pete has shared with us many times in many of his books that, and this is a man who's been healing his own CPTSD for 40 years, and he's a clinician in California who's helped thousands of people and millions of readers of his books. He states that grieving, the act of grieving, which is what we are talking about right now, is the heart of emotional intelligence. Because when we are able to grieve, it releases the toxic shame and fear that blocks us and our ability to give and receive love. What he is saying here is that the ability to grieve includes finding ways to love ourselves and feeling worthy of the love of others, and learning to love life itself. So for those of us who struggle with loving ourselves, receiving love from others, and loving life itself, Pete says at the top of page 263 that grieving is an essential life skill. It is a high EQ aspect of emotional intelligence that helps human beings to recover from many kinds of loss and calamity. And in the treatment of CPTSD, grieving is effective to the degree, don't miss this, that both therapists and survivors learn to grieve in all 4 essential ways: crying, angering, verbally venting, and fully feeling. And he says that this is the key to us learning to be able to love ourselves, receive love from others, and to learn and experience what it feels like to love life. So I don't know about you, but if Pete says that this is what I need to do to experience love, to freely give and receive love, and to love life and enjoy life, then I'm going to sit up straight and I'm going to pay attention. Okay? So he says it's a transformative process. And for those of you who are just joining us for this series that we're doing, we started off a few weeks ago talking about arrested emotional development, and what arrested emotional development causes is it causes delays in our development, you and I who experience childhood trauma, in the emotional dimension of life. And these delays that we experience as traumatized children, struggling to survive, what this does is if we are able to address the reality and face head on the arrested development that we experienced, meaning that we didn't develop the same way other people did because of the family of origin trauma that we experienced, that we can actually heal this portion of our lives and go on to give and receive love freely and learn to love life. So now that I've caught us up and made sure that we're all on the same page here, I am going to check in with everyone who's here, making sure that the volume is where it needs to be, because it was brought to my attention recently that my voice is just a little bit too soft. So yes, Kitty, loving life can definitely be difficult. I most definitely agree with you. Absolutely, I agree. Yes, and Jeffrey, I agree with you. We do need a life that we can love and not just endure. Hello, brave Vanessa. We warmly welcome you. Thank you, Candida, for letting me know that the volume is really good. I really appreciate that. Hey, Marzui. Marzui says, I wish there was a class in how to grieve. I am grieving deficient. That's what this is, actually. Marzui, I'm waving a wand. Your wish has been granted. Marzui, I'm waving a wand and your wish has been granted. This is a masterclass on grieving. And go back a few weeks and re-listen to all of the replays and listen to particularly the last couple of weeks, tonight, and then in the next 3 or 4 weeks as well. Okay? A warm welcome to you, Karen. We warmly welcome you to our community. I may be meeting you for the very first time. We're so glad you're here. Welcome, welcome. We're on the topic of grief, and we are discussing Pete Walker's most recent book, Holistically Treating Complex PTSD, a Six-Dimensional Approach. And, oh good, I'm so glad, Marzui. Well, hello, Carrie, long time no see. Oh, I'm so happy to see you. We're so glad you're here. Welcome back. Welcome back, family. Yes, grief from CPTSD, grief in general. Yes. So here we go. We're going to dive right in to the bottom of page 273. And we're on the topic of angering. And it starts off with a quote from Theodore Rubin, Compassion and Self-Hate. And then Pete dives right into the topic of angering. So here we go. Theodore Rubin says, anger is probably the most maligned of all human emotions. It is repressed more than any other emotion. Its repression, as well as its inevitable emergence, produces a great deal of anxiety, more than any other psychological mechanism we engage in. This, in turn, makes for a host of symptoms, all of which are forms of rage at oneself or self-hate. Despite cultural pressure and propaganda to the contrary, we human beings who are healthy enough to feel anything must generate anger many, many times in our life. End quote. Pete says, angering is from the verb anger. I use this term to describe the process of actively expressing anger in safe and healthy ways. Nevertheless, the taboo against anger is so widespread that I feel I cannot emphasize this enough. Anger can be expressed therapeutically in ways that do not hurt the survivor or anyone else. In a seemingly paradoxical way, angering safely and responsibly often improves survivors' relationships with themselves and with others, and their ability to truly feel loving and feel loved. Angering is an essential to effective grieving as crying. Let me repeat that because I misspoke. Pete says, and this is page 274, angering is as essential to effective grieving as crying. Angering allows survivors to release the part of their childhood pain that is an accumulation of unexpressed, healthy protests about parental injustices. Angering allows the energy of that pain to be emoted, to be moved out of the body through the sounds and bodily motions of expressing anger. Many survivors arrive in adulthood unconscious of the simmering furnaces of anger that lie buried inside of them. Denied a direct and full release, this stored anger often smolders just below awareness, causing survivors to chronically stew in anxiety, irritability, resentfulness, cynicism, and self-hatred. Even worse, for some, that it periodically flares out as hostile words and actions that destroy potential intimacy with others. Many survivors do not believe that they have repressed anger, despite their unconscious molten core. Few remember the volcano that often erupted out of them as infants and toddlers until it was driven unconscious by punishing caretakers. Here is Alice Miller describing the process by which that volcano became dormant. If clients had been able, as children, to express their disappointment with their parents, to experience their rage and anger, they could have stayed alive. But that would have led to the loss of their love, and that, for a child, is the same as death. So, they killed their anger, and with it, a vital part of themselves. End quote. Pete goes on, bottom of page 274. Guiding survivors to develop a healthy expression of anger is essential. When they do not recover access to their developmentally arrested anger, recoveries remain stuck in the misery of unwittingly letting the venomous blame of their inner critic and internalized parents trigger them into toxic shame. Therapists can teach survivors to redirect shame and toxic blame back to whomever it came from in the past. Survivors can be taught to do this safely in ways that motivate them to fight off, mute, shrink, and exercise the malignant critic. With enough practice and encouragement, survivors increasingly fortify their internal boundaries against their introjected childhood abusers. Survivors can practice angering alone or, even more powerfully, in the presence of a validating witness, such as a therapist or trusted friend. Once angering becomes egocentric, however, most angering is best done silently in the privacy of survivors' own psyches. There is often a need to do this silently because critic attacks can come at any time 24/7. And in early recovery, frequent, consistent practice with angering is needed to build effective, thought-stopping shields against inner critic attacks. Unfortunately, many survivors are so identified with their critic that it becomes their whole identity. Such survivors typically need to prioritize fighting off the critic numerous times a day until they are increasingly able to access the healthy egoic function of unrelenting self-protectiveness, both internally and externally. So I'm pausing here on page 275 because I want to paraphrase this paragraph here where Pete says that we, survivors, are oftentimes so deeply identified with our inner critic or the voices of our abusive caregivers that it becomes our entire identity, and we end up in self-loathing and self-hatred. And if we continue doing that, we will never heal. So what we need to do in order to heal is we need to prioritize fighting off the inner critic numerous times a day, every day, until we are increasingly able to access the healthy self-protectiveness that an advocate would have, that a healthy, good enough, loving parent would have. Please don't miss this. This is the message. This is, for me personally, the takeaway. Because I, a survivor of repeated relational trauma at the hands of those with whom I was entrusted, I, who am healing CPTSD as a result of ongoing dysfunction, neglect, and abuse and exploitation within my family of origin, because of all of that, I am deeply identified with my inner critic that is the voice of my abusers. And if I am going to ever heal, learn to love and receive love and love life and be able to experience joy, my homework, my mission, should I choose to accept it from Pete, is that I need to prioritize fighting off the inner critic that is the voice of my abusers. And I need to do this numerous times a day, every day, until I am increasingly able to access my own good enough inner parent, my own self-advocate. And in order to do that, I have to get in touch with my anger. And you all have been with me here. Many of us have been here for the better part of a decade, or more than a decade, every single week. And you know that if I ever am going on some sort of a mama bear rant, it is never because of something that happened to me. More often than not, I don't want to say never, but more often than not, it is because something has been shared in our community. Something has been done to someone that I care about, someone I know who is vulnerable. I struggle to access my inner good enough parent, my advocate. I struggle to be able to access that healthy angering multiple times a day, every single day, so that I can silence that inner critic and stop identifying with my internalized voice of my abusers, right? I struggle with that. So if you are like me and you struggle to advocate for yourself, but you are able to advocate for, anyone else, another human, another adult, a child, a pet, someone who is an underdog, someone who has been harmed, whatever it is that helps you, yes, you, if you can hear my voice, I'm talking to you. Whatever it is that helps you get in touch with the good enough parent that lives inside of you, whatever it is that helps you get in touch with your anger so that you can silence the voice of your abusers that wants to shame you and blame you and silence you and tell you that you're a horrible person for experiencing anger, whatever you need to do to access that advocate inside of you, I want to encourage you to do so. Because I know that's what I need to do. That's exactly what I need to do. So I'm going to go on and I'm going to finish reading now. That was my soapbox rant. You're welcome. And if it wasn't helpful, then that's okay. We'll move on and we'll talk about things that are more helpful for you, hopefully. Pete continues, bottom of page 275, and he says, angering also serves to rescue survivors from the childlike sense of helplessness and hopelessness into which they frequently flash back. Therapists can model and catalyze this healthy self-defense by disclosing their own anger about the terrible unfairness of children being negatively conditioned into a lifetime deluge of inner critic attacks and emotional flashbacks. They can also remind their clients that they inhabit an adult psyche and body with which they can now defend themselves, and over time these boundaries then increasingly move them out of harm's way. They build safety from the bullying of others and safety from the most damaging bully of all, the inner critic, the voice of their abuser. And with enough practice, survivors progressively experience ongoing lessening of their abandonment melange being triggered, that self-abandonment that we experience. And Pete says at the top of 276, finally, angering also empowers the myriad thought and perspective corrections and substitutions needed to establish survivors' internal sense of safety and worthiness. Angering bolsters them for the long-term, gradual journey of building positive self-image and openness to intimacy. I'm looking at you. I'm looking at you. Yes, you. You, those of us here who struggle with anger, those of us who struggle with building positive self-image, those of us who struggle with being open to intimacy with other humans, yeah, if we allow ourselves, I'm going to read this paragraph over. Pete says, angering empowers thought and perspective corrections and substitutions that are needed to establish survivors' internal sense of safety and worthiness. Angering bolsters us for the long-term gradual journey of building positive self-image and openness to intimacy. We deserve this. Pete addresses the taboo against anger in this next section and transference, which is hugely helpful. If you are new to the term of transference and countertransference, prepare to be mind blown and enlightened, because it's very, very, very helpful. So in the middle of page 276, Pete says the widespread The widespread epidemic, not academic, but epidemic of senseless violence in our society makes it even more difficult for many therapists and survivors to welcome anger into their lives. This is further exacerbated by the camouflaged violence that is rife in the sarcasm and put down of so much of our social and cultural discourse. Anger also looks especially threatening to clients because of their parents' verbal, emotional, and physical violence towards them when they were defenseless children. There is great denial in our culture that words are sometimes deadly weapons. Dysfunctional parents can destroy their children's self-esteem with incessant criticism alone. This is why Bradshaw named the pathological parenting dynamic of toxic shaming soul murder. Even worse, some childhood trauma victims who were incessantly wounded with verbal cruelty are driven to kill themselves or someone else. Let me also emphasize here, this is Pete speaking on page 276. He says, let me also emphasize here that most survivors who are not pre-psychotic or laden with personality disorders can learn to release their anger safely and therapeutically. Those who are should not be encouraged to do anger work, as it could cause them to decompensate. Others may have been so hurt by anger in childhood that they cannot or will not open to their own anger. An aversion to anger can also be further exacerbated by survivors' unpleasant encounters with their own anger. When anger is denied expression, it often accumulates and morphs into painful, fuming perseverations that eventually erupt into violent words or actions. Some survivors totally renounce their anger because they hate themselves for their outbursts and or for the violent fantasies that recurringly invade and ruminate in their consciousness. Typically, these types need to recover their developmentally arrested capacity to cry. When someone is hurt, no amount of angering can release the part of the pain that can only be resolved by crying. And we talked a lot about crying last week. Now, Pete transitions here on page 277 into the topic of anger and transference. Now, for those of you who are new to the term of transference, transference is a Freudian concept that describes how a repressed, hurtful experience from the past can emotionally re-emerge in the present and be unconsciously attributed to someone who is reminiscent of the original persecutor. So think of it as, let's say you unknowingly and against your own will, seemingly, go off on someone and you rage out at someone and it's disproportionate to the current situation. This can be described as maybe like road rage or getting mad at someone at a restaurant. If you are verbally unkind to someone and looking back, once you're in a cooler headspace, you go, wow, where did that come from? That didn't make any sense. They got my order wrong, and I unleashed a 10-minute tirade on them. That wasn't fair. That is the phenomenon that Freud coined the term transference. So, transference is often a central dynamic of emotional flashbacks. And for those of us here healing CPTSD have experienced emotional flashbacks for sure. So it also accounts for much of the cultural violence described in the last section that we just talked about at the taboo of angering. A lot of that is transference, like the disproportionate level of rage and anger on someone. And we're like, wow, where did that come from? That is transference. Okay? So transference typically occurs when individuals feel and or express intense upset over a relatively minor offense, and the source of the excessive part of their response is usually their reservoir of unexpressed hurt and anger about past injustices. A typical example of this is seen in someone who rages at another's relatively harmless transgression, and perhaps the wounded party is innocently interrupted in a conversation and then instantly feels enraged. Not uncommonly, the person might be flashing back to having been constantly cut off in their attempts to express themselves in childhood. This person is then transferring all of that hurt to the current situation. Hence, transference is often an emotional flashback to past unprocessed hurt about weightier unfairness from childhood. Therapists can harvest remedial healing from such flashback and transferential occurrences, and they can encourage survivors to associate what the current situation reminds them of. They can invite them into, what does this remind you of? When do you remember feeling this way? And once this is identified, survivors can then be invited to therapeutically cathart out their old repressed anger at historical abusers in safe ways that do not hurt anyone, including themselves. And then Pete says that we're going to talk about this in an upcoming section called Techniques of Angering, for guidelines for safe, to ensure safe catharsis. So such catharsis ultimately aids us, the survivors of complex trauma, to work through and resolve old ungrieved hurts in ways that protect us from inappropriately projecting onto innocent others in the future. Now, another example of transference occurs many thousands of times every day on the highways in the form of road rage. Pete says, I used to feel quite angry at people who did not single their lane change, even when they had plenty of room and did it safely. Had it been a dangerous lane change, it would be normal to feel angry. It is normal for the anger of the fight response to come up when one is endangered by another's careless actions. Thankfully, I eventually had an epiphany while driving. Unsignaled lane changes reminded me of all the times my parents attacked me out of the blue without warning. Once I ventilated enough of my hurt feelings about this abuse, I began to sense that 90% of my upset about unsignaled lane changes was about my parents' sudden frightening outbursts. And as I plumbed this transference more deeply, I saw that their frequent crashing into me triggered me whenever drivers moved into my lane without warning. Thankfully, I have therapeutically grieved out the lion's share of my repressed anger at my parents' penchant for surprise attacks and bad lane changes or sudden encounters with people who look menacing rarely trigger me into emotionally upsetting flashbacks. And this is because I no longer have a reservoir of unprocessed anger to project from. So now we talk about Freud's concept of transference and how that turns against ourselves. I'm going to get a sip of water, and I want to invite you to do the same. Just make yourselves very comfortable. Okay, so now we're at the top of page 279 in section that Pete calls transference against the self. Many of us survivors unconsciously let our inner critics transfer and turn the rage into internal verbal and emotional violence against ourselves. So, therapists can help us to unpack this dynamic by guiding us safely and therapeutically to direct our anger toward the gross injustices of our own childhoods. They can then help us to harvest the unreleased childhood anger to fight off the worst injustice of all, which is being conditioned into developing a vicious inner critic, which we have and may still have, and no means to resist or even identify it. Safe, pragmatic, and therapeutic techniques of using angering to wither this nasty proxy of our traumatizing caretakers are presented in the section after this one. So, most untreated complex trauma survivors unconsciously and continuously release the intense pressure of accumulated repressed anger via irritably chastising ourselves for a host of imperfections. We pick on ourselves, and we can be like a rabid dog chasing its own tail and tearing it to shreds. This becomes cruelly unjust when our angering devolves into us getting angry at ourselves for being angry. In our striving not to be angry, we act in by violently railing against ourselves for hours, or we act out by being physically violent with ourselves. A typical example occurs when a survivor is consumed in an inner tirade of self-hate and unwittingly creates painful accidents. Accidents, in fact, are often violent and unconscious releases of anger against the self. Accidentally smashing one's thumb with a hammer can quickly become an unconscious excuse to scream bloody murder. And, of course, some accidents are truly accidental, as Freud implied when he said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Dysfunctional displacements of anger are also seen in survivors who over-rely on angering to release their pain. Typically, this often occurs because they still cannot release their hurt through crying. Quite understandably, this looks like narcissistic behavior to others, and in turn alienates them from angering. Therapists can help such survivors to see that no amount of angering can fully release abandonment pain without relatively equal amounts of crying. Ironically, survivors will continue to inadvertently hurt themselves and their loved ones with unconscious angry behaviors if they do not renounce the renunciation of anger and find safe ways to release the anger. So in regards to the 4F types, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, untreated fight and fight type hybrids will periodically tip the cauldrons of their repressed anger and scald others and or ourselves. Fight types can become so driven that their rushing leads to painful anger-triggering missteps and accidents. Fawn and freeze types angrily perseverate about minor social disappointments. This often leads them into giving up and ghosting good enough relationships that could have been salvaged if they worked through their transferential anger. This next section here is called the not-so-merry-go-round cycle of repression, accumulation, explosion, and guilt. So, ironically, the process of angering by acting out and acting in often leaves many of us survivors feeling so bad about ourselves that we redouble our efforts to permanently extinguish our anger. And as such, we unconsciously construct a psychological hamster wheel in a self and intimacy destroying cycle of repression, accumulation, explosion, guilt, repression. So it starts off with an explosion, and then we feel guilty, and then we repress the guilt, and then that accumulates, and when it accumulates, we explode. and then we feel guilty for the explosion, and then we repress our anger and our guilt, and then the repression of our anger and our guilt accumulates, and then once it accumulates enough, then we explode again. And then after that explosion, we feel guilty, and then repression, and then accumulation, and then it explodes. So explosion, guilt, repression, accumulation is the vicious cycle, or as Pete calls it, the not so merry-go-round. And then he says on page 281, as such, repression of anger leads to its accumulation, which eventually peaks with an embarrassing explosion that in turn invokes painful guilt, which leads to once again repressing anger ad infinitum. How sadly ironic that so much antagonism is caused by sincere efforts to exterminate potentially disruptive feelings. Therapists can help us, the survivors, break this cycle that makes us victims of our own anger. Therapists can guide and encourage us to befriend our anger and refuse to guiltily squelch it every time it arises. And instead, we can use the safe and effective anger releasing techniques that follow. So here are some safe and cathartic techniques for angering. And it starts with a quote by Emily Dickinson. Anger, as soon as fed, is dead. 'Tis starving makes it fat. I'm going to read that again, and I'll read it without the Old English. Emily Dickinson says that as soon as we feed the anger, it dies. The only thing that makes our anger stay and get fat is when we starve it. Okay, so it's quite paradoxical, and it doesn't make any sense, but it's super, super true. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Pete says, let me reiterate the caveat that there are some survivors who do not benefit from these techniques and may decompensate from using them. Wise therapists will refrain from using them with survivors afflicted with personality disorders or a history of decompensating. Fortunately, the vast majority of survivors, Freud's normal neurotics, typically benefit greatly from using safe anger-releasing techniques. Angering is the grieving technique of ardently objecting to current or past hurts, losses, and injustices. Survivors need to anger and sometimes rage about the intimidation, humiliation, and neglect that was passed off to them as nurturance in their childhoods. I'm going to read that again. For those of us who struggle to access our anger, page 282, Pete says, angering is the grieving technique of objecting to current or past hurts, losses, and injustices. Survivors need to anger and sometimes rage about the intimidation, humiliation, and neglect that was passed off to them as nurturance in their childhoods. Therapists can psychoeducate and encourage clients to anger about their repressed, healthy resentment, about the lack of safety and support in their childhoods. The vignette near the end of chapter 4 models championing survivors in this way. Therapists facilitate healthy angering by resonating with and validating their clients' anger about years of parental betrayals. They can validate survivors' outrage about specific types of caretaker abuse that they suffered. And when he talks about chapter 4, remember when I was sharing with you ethical self-disclosure and how Pete shares his outrage, and he talks about how angry he is about the abuse that one of his patients was enduring? That's what he's referring to. So when he says that we can validate survivors' outrage about specific types of caretaker abuse that they suffered and or the neglect of never having anyone to go to for guidance or protection, no one who was safe, no one to appeal to for fairness, no one who was proud of them and their uniqueness. Therapists are wise to guide survivors to express intense anger without being destructive and without disturbing anyone within earshot. They can also be shown that they can anger intensely and therapeutically in a whispery voice. Anger is especially therapeutic when survivors rail against their caretakers for indoctrinating them into not only noticing themselves negatively and contemptuously, but recoveries benefit greatly when they angrily vent about the cruel injustice of having a merciless inner critic implanted in them that continuously triggers them into self-alienating flashbacks, angrily saying no or shut up to the critic, the deputy of their dysfunctional caretakers. It externalizes their anger in a healthy way, and it empowers survivors to refrain from turning their anger against themselves and allows them to revive the lost instinct of defending themselves against unjust attack. Our therapists need to introduce us to many safe, harmless techniques for releasing anger, and these safe, harmless techniques can range along a continuum of intensity that can start with something as simple as angry thinking and visualizing, and then graduate to cathartic writing, to fuming, to heated speaking, to irate shouting, to shadow boxing, to pounding on pillows with fists or a tennis racket, and it can even culminate in safely breaking expendable objects. However, swearing and cursing typically brings an especially powerful release that often crescendos into alleviating laughter. I can attest to this. I'm able to curse like just for a really long period of time with my therapist, and we both end up laughing. So consciously sublimating anger into vigorous work or play is another effective and useful way of releasing anger. Sublimation is a process of channeling angry energy into playful or constructive activities such as dancing, exercising, gardening, cleaning, or chopping wood. At some point in our healing journey, it is especially therapeutic for us to engage in the more dramatic activities of angering, like screaming and hitting pillows. Many of us gradually work up to this and begin angering by simply owning and talking about our anger. In the long run, however, a fully engaged experience of raging can be especially liberating. It can help survivors to let go of the fear that getting really mad will make them go crazy or run amok. To the contrary, in my experience, it usually makes them laugh in relief when they see that they do not decompensate. What a relief it is for survivors to get that they no longer need to habitually suppress their anger. Nonetheless, it's also important to note that not everyone has to experience full-bore rage to reawaken their instinct of self-protectiveness. Some survivors can invoke subtler forms of authentic angering to attain the sense of safety and release. With enough initial therapeutic warm witnessing, many survivors can acquire great relief from angering privately and even silently. Therapeutic angering can unlock joy. Therapeutic angering often unlocks joy. When survivors break through a lifelong repression of their anger, they often feel exuberant relief. During the years when I led anger release workshops, most participants became visibly lighthearted and jovial after engaging in the more intense techniques of angering. Not infrequently, those who raged as wholeheartedly as possible, who screamed and allowed anger to fully come into their voices, they often ended up belly laughing. I believe this is part of the reason why sporting events and music concerts are so popular. These are two of the only places in our culture where screaming is acceptable, and joy often flows freely at these events. Safe, harmless destruction of dispensable items is a potent anger release technique that typically stimulates laughter, well-being, and a sense of personal empowerment and safety. I have taught many survivors how to shred phone books by striking them with a 2-foot section of a rubber hose. Many of my clients and students report great gains from using this technique, originally invented by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. My first lessons in the value of harmless anger release techniques ironically occurred in the Army. In 2 places where I was stationed, bad feelings between individuals were occasionally settled in safe fighting rituals. Antagonists don pugil equipment, protective pads and helmets that cover all parts of the body, and they attacked each other with 4-foot-long foam-covered staffs. Typically, they fought to exhaustion. I never saw anyone get injured. Relationships were often mended, and there was a great deal of hilarity amongst both participants and observers. Along this line, there are some wonderful self-defense workshops for women that use safe, full-contact self-protection exercises to fight off a padded and helmeted attacker. This process is often enhanced with a hearty encouragement from the trainers and the participants. I've seen numerous women survivors greatly benefit from these trainings. Here are 2 agencies that provide these trainings with a great deal of sensitivity to issues of recovering from trauma. One is called modelmugging.org. Modelmugging.org. And another is called impactselfdefense.org. That's impactselfdefense.org. It's often easier to recover anger than it is to recover tears. When survivors truly want to reclaim their anger, the continued practice of angering techniques will, in most cases, fire them up enough to genuinely become angry. Several of my clients made this breakthrough on their own by smashing bottles in the bins of a recycling center. Others broke through while chopping wood, and many stumbled into their genuine anger via the more traditional methods of hitting a mattress or a pillow with a fist or a tennis racket or a plastic bat. In chapters 5 and 7 of my very first book, The Tao of Fully Feeling, I described in considerable detail safe processes for angering out childhood pain in ways that do not hurt the survivor or anyone else. Once again, I never advocate that survivors directly blame or anger at their living parents in person. I have found that the most therapeutic place to direct anger is at the survivor's internalized caretakers, the chief introjected members of their inner critic committee that can fuel the toxic critic for a lifetime if they remain unchallenged. One exception to this occurs when a parent is still abusive or will only stop if they are verbally restrained. However, even in that situation, it is usually better handled by going no contact with the parents. This and other exceptions are explored in depth in the last half of the Tao of Fully Feeling book. And finally, let me share my delight and hopeful optimism about a repeated airing of a mental health TV commercial that I saw recently. It was about the health benefits of getting one's anger out harmlessly. Parents were playfully acting as if they were angry dragons, getting their anger out with growling sounds and mighty gesticulations, which they successfully encouraged their delighted children to mimic, who then roared with laughter. I'm going to pause here, and I'm just going to check and see how much more we have on angering. Because remember, I told you last week that angering was probably going to be 2 weeks. You might have to break anger into 2 weeks. Yeah, I think we might need, let me just see what time it is. Yeah, it's already been an hour. Next week, we will finish up the topic of angering. We will start on page 286 next week, and we will end on page 292. and we'll have an open discussion about anger. And then the following week, we will start with the topic of verbal ventilation. And Pete Walker does call verbal ventilation the golden path to intimacy. And please know that when we talk about intimacy on this particular YouTube channel, we're not necessarily referring to sexual intimacy. We're referring to the phenomenon that we experience when we feel safe enough, seen, heard, valued, understood, connected, warmly witnessed, fully acknowledged. We walk away from a situation having a felt sense of empathy. That, all within the context of safe enoughness, that is intimacy. So we're going to dive into verbal ventilation, which Pete Walker talks about as being directly connected to how we will be able to experience intimacy in our friendships and relationships. And I do look forward to finishing up the angering topic next week. And if I do say so myself, I showed up tonight with you all feeling really raw and really tender and really struggling. And I'm so grateful that I got an opportunity to sit here with you and to talk about this topic. Because talking about a topic like anger and being able to sit with the reality of just the idea of anger, what that did for me is it helped me realize that I have choices and I have tools, and sometimes all I need to do is hold space for myself to access my tools and my choices. So when I'm feeling just really, really tender and raw and like I'm really struggling and on the verge of tears with everything, just whether it's the funeral that I attended a few days ago and just the cumulative nature of grief in and of itself, and just the loss of my granddaughter, and just grief in general, the grieving of my own healing journey, right? Everything that I didn't experience in childhood, everything that I did experience, right? Grief is cumulative. And so for me, what I'm walking away with tonight is I showed up in a very tearful, emotional, tender place. And even temporarily being able to read about a topic such as anger helped me to shift the energy that I had that was very tearful and tender and vulnerable. And I was able to shift that energy into holding space here with you, my community, my family, my friendly family of choice, so that we could contemplate and glance at the possibilities of what it might look like to anger in healthy and safe ways. So, yet again, Uncle Pete for the win. As many of you know, we talk a lot in this community about creating a fantasy family, very similar to what people out there in the sports world do, like fantasy football and fantasy teams. In our community, we create a fantasy family, and we pick our absolute ideal dream. We get to hope beyond all hope, no holds barred. We look at if we could possibly have experienced one person in one particular position in our lives, who would it have been? So for me, Pete Walker would have been my uncle. And I would have been able to see him as often as I wanted, and he would have spoke wisdom into my life, and he would have been protective and emotionally intelligent and kind, and I would have had a role model, right? So Uncle Pete for the win, helping me get in touch with my anger. I picture him showing me how to take a plastic wiffle bat and hit pillows, and how to scream into pillows and express my anger. I picture Uncle Pete being one of those dragons and roaring, and me mimicking this roaring and being able to access my anger. And yeah, so yeah, how about you? Who's in your fantasy family? For me, there's Mama Melody, Melody Beatty, Grandma Louise, Louise Hay. There's Papa Bessel. There's Nana Judith, my Nana, Judith Herman. So Nana Judith, Papa Bessel. You know, if I could have any brother in the whole world, it would probably be Marshall Bircher. He is such a good human. I get to sit under his teaching and feel safe. And I imagine that is what siblings do, is they help you to feel safe and seen and understood and valuable and heard. There's cousin Lisa Romano. There's Auntie Ariel, Dr. Ariel Schwartz, Auntie Ariel. There's my niece, Shahida Arabi, the most just brilliant. It's like the niece that just outperforms every person in the entire family, right? Oh, yes, Papa Bradshaw. Oh, yes. Oh, there we go. Yes, Papa Bradshaw. I love this. Oh, you know, we get to have as many people as we want in our fantasy family. As many people as we want. But yeah, Shahida Arabi is my niece, my fantasy niece. And she just is, I mean, you name it, Ivy League scholar, researcher, freaking brilliant self-care warrior. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I think it's good that we get to talk about these types of things. So, thank you all so much for your presence. I'm so glad this is helpful for you. Lisa, I'm so glad it's helpful for you. Thank you to each of you. Thank you. All of you. Yeah, so grateful. Ooh, Deb Dana. Yes, she can be my cousin for sure. Ooh, Gabor Mate. Someone pronounced his name Gabor Mate the other day, but most people pronounce it Gabor Mate. I suppose I should look that up, right? So that I am pronouncing it properly. Yes, Irene Lyon. Love her so much. And what about my fantasy sister, Svava Brooks? Oh, she's just so amazing, incredible. And interestingly, let me put a link to our community. For those of you who are looking, yes, Diane Langberg. Oh, she could be my grandmother, my maternal grandmother for sure. So interestingly, the reason I put the link to the community, I have such an honor. I consider it an honor and a privilege to get to volunteer with some of the most incredible humans. Oak, Christina, Jennifer, Naima, Mark, Matt, Rhonda, Mindy, Sabra, Iris, Jean, Adam, Paul Michael, Shirley, Carly. There are so many. Yeah, and sometimes Brene Brown. Yeah, it's not 100% for me, but she's definitely the eclectic aunt that comes to the family reunion and spouts off some massive wisdom. And most of her stuff definitely resonates with me for sure. So, oh, I missed something. Oh, I missed it. I missed it, Jeffrey. I'm so sorry. My chat box is frozen. John Harvey says, Dirty Harry is my uncle. Oh, Jeffrey Sherman says, can I say Mama Bear Athena, please? Of course you can. I'm honored to even be nominated. It's an honor just to be nominated. You all are so amazing. Can you all just be my siblings? Can we all just like, we are family. We are family. Get up, everybody, sing. We'll talk about this more. I think it's super, super, super helpful. Ninja Taco will always and forever be my recovery buddy. Oh, thank you, Ninja Taco. Thank you, John Harvey. Thank you, Jeffrey Sherman. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Brave Vanessa. Thank you, Midnight Blue. Thank you, Merzui. Thank you, Kitty. Thank you, Lisa Marie. Thank you, Candida. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Kate. Oh, thank you. Appreciate each of you so, 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 so much. So I'll see you over in our community. And if I do not see you over there every single day, James is one of our newest volunteers as well. He's pretty awesome. We're going to do like movement and breath work with James, which is amazing. I just met with him. He's a newer volunteer. Sonia is a newer volunteer. Shalini is a newer volunteer. Yeah, we're volunteer led, we're community funded. It's incredible. It's just like this, but it's like every day, you know? But if I don't see you over there, don't worry. I will be back here next Monday and every Monday. And I love you all so much. Thank you for being in my life. Thank you for allowing me to be in your lives. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Please be extra kind and patient and gentle with yourselves, as Jeffrey would say, because you're worth it. And I will see you soon. Good night, everyone.